So I want to talk about modernity, modernism, William Faulkner, and As I Lay Dying. That's a lot to do in one video lecture. But I'm hoping this video lecture will work in tandem with the introduction to As I Lay Dying that I want you to read carefully before you dig into the text. And I think these two tools combined will give you a good working starting point for understanding the text. So let's dig in. Modernity is the emergence in the early 20th century of really the outlines of the culture that we're still living in today. And there is a sort of collision between a series of historical events and a series of changes in material culture that happen at the same time, that have sort of mutual causality to them, that create a philosophical crisis that artists like William Faulkner are responding to. So if we think about some of the benchmark moments of the early 20th century, we're talking about catastrophes like 10 million people dying in World War I at the hands of weaponry of unheard of technological sophistication and destructive power. An influenza epidemic that kills millions around the world, including 500,000 in the United States alone. 500,000. Imagine if that kind of number hit America today. Think about our recent anxiety about epidemics, our current anxiety about epidemics. And you realize that we have long been protected from something that was a really profound horror of the early 20th century. In terms of race, the Klan is reemerging with greater power. We've got segregation, Jim Crow in the South, and the Great Migration that's precipitated by those things. We've got the 18th Amendment, which is going to ban alcohol consumption and create a whole kind of underworld of alcohol consumption and criminality to support it. The 19th Amendment, which is the culmination of the women's, almost 100-year-old women's suffrage movement. Women are finally given the legal right to vote. I shouldn't say given. Women finally win the legal right to vote. The Scopes monkey trials, the famous battle over evolution and its place in our schools and in science instruction in the schools. And but lurking behind all of this are major economic shifts that begin in the Gilded Age of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, but accelerate in the early 20th century. We're talking about the continued economic polarization between rich and poor, what we know today as an increased income inequality of the early 20th century, which, by the way, emerged again in the late 20th and early 21st century, right? We're in the middle of a cycle of increased income inequality. Hearing a lot about that in the election and the current election cycle. So huge changes are occurring on a historic front. And these changes are in dialogue with, in some ways, a result of, in some ways, the creators of a series of shifts in material culture. And those patterns are important. And I think as I talk about them, you'll say, oh, we got that today still. And that is true, that much of what emerges in this early 20th century modernity becomes enduring and are still linchpin elements of our culture today. So corporate capitalism emerges as very powerful. The alliance between government and corporate capitalism that people are debating intensely in our current election really emerges in the Gilded Age, but becomes deeply anchored in our culture in the 20s, in the teens and 20s of this early period of modernity. I talked about the income inequality that's a result of that, the shift from a rural economy to an urban economy that begins after the Civil War really picks up steam in the early 20th century. Connected to this new urbanity, right, this new shift to an urban culture is this mass culture of leisure and entertainment that dominates our lives to this day. And while for us today that mass culture is captured in television and the internet, in the early 20s and in the early 20th century, it was radio that was the breakthrough vehicle for an emerging national culture, right? A whole country could listen to a radio program. Not that there weren't also local programs, but we get this sort of nationwide culture emerging. Movies become big. during this period. We evolved from the silence to the great classic films of the 30s and 40s. The record industry explodes in the early 20th century. Now we download files, but then we had discs, and people played those discs on phonographs, which were expensive but popular. Things like washing machines. Ford sold its 15 millionth car, I believe, somewhere around 1920s. There are millions of cars on the road. So we have this culture of conspicuous consumption that many of us might remember from our high school history classes as epitomized by the Roaring '20s, right? The party life and the dancing and the music and the fashion that emerge. And many of these kind of ideas, while they've taken different forms today, the fundamental patterns, right, of pop cultural music and high cultural fashion, these ideas take hold in this early modernity of the 20th century American culture. And then very importantly is the power of technology. The technological sublime during World War I is a destructive sublime, right? The immense capacity of humans to destroy each other. And then it emerges in the early 20th century as this deeply admired tool of civilization, right? So you have downtown Manhattan, right, as this high watermark of American architectural and scientific and engineering genius. And as American cultural critic Robert Hughes said in the 1980s, when he was writing about the American of the early 20th century, he said, the real heroes for early 20th century Americans weren't artists like William Faulkner or our great painters or sculptors. They were engineers and builders and designers. America, early modernist America, the early America modernity of the early 20th century was dominated by this culture that idealized streamlined styles and order and speed and efficiency. So the collision of this material culture with these historical events that I've described create a growing sense of alienation and fragmentation that shows up in American art. So to see this visually, before we talk about what Faulkner does with it through language, here's a classic Edward Hopper painting called The Hotel Room. And in it, by the way, painted in 1931, right around the same time the Empire State Building is constructed, which I think is 1930, it's this sense of, you see here this austerity in this room. It is an icon of modernity. The clean, sharp lines, the efficiency of the room itself, and then the sort of alienation and isolation of the woman in the room. She feels disconnected from the world, her slumping posture. It looks depressing, right, we might say. And this is something that artists respond to. And in that sense, you can argue that modernism, the art movement, is a response to modernity and the onset of modernity. And the onset of modernity, I'm going to argue this semester, creates three crises that our artists are trying to respond to. The first is an epistemological crisis. How do you make sense of a world where millions of people can be destroyed over a course of a few years of war? How do you make sense of a world where technology has such power to enhance our lives and destroy our lives? What does all that mean about our traditional ideals of truth? Where does God fit in? Where does transcendence fit in? Many writers and artists and average Americans were wondering about this great questioning of ideas and beliefs that had for centuries been unquestioned, really in America from the Civil War on, start to become increasingly questioned. And that questioning, that doubt, that anxiety about what is real and what is true and what is transcendent, that anxiety escalates during this period of modernity, and it fuels a lot of what we know as modernist art. Basically, the old ways are inadequate, so we have to start thinking about new ways to make sense of this rapidly changing new world. Parallel with this is a cultural crisis, right? With all this change going on in terms of historical events and material culture, what role does religion play in such a world? What role does family play? Does that change? Does that evolve? Is family liberating or constraining? What about gender? What about class? What about race? All these tensions we've been looking at all semester take on a new intensity in the modernist moment, right? And then finally, there's an artistic crisis. What is the role of the artist in this culture of alienation and fragmentation? And I think what you're going to find is that modernist art challenges the alienation and fragmentation that dominates early modernity in America and the world. And it does so by first depicting the disorientation and disruption of the modern world. But as it does so, it's protesting that. So it's saying, look at this chaos. Look at it. This isn't how we should be. And I believe that one of the things that distinguishes modernism from postmodernism, a later movement that we'll look at, is that modernists, while they see a world in chaos, still long for and search for transcendence. And they often search for that transcendence through human expression, through their own artistic endeavor. And often that artistic endeavor is a form of protest. So I like to show students, as a way of seeing sort of the visual dynamics of modernism, this Pablo Picasso painting, which I also believe is from 1930. We're really fixated on 1930 here in terms of our imagery, aren't we? And this is called Guernica, and it's a famous modernist painting, and you can see why, right? It's so disruptive and disorienting, but it's actually protesting the horrible brutality of the Spanish Civil War and the destructive weaponry and the destructive power unleashed upon the people of Spain through this war. And so while it depicts the disruption and the chaos and the literally disembodiment, right, of early 20th century life, it's also protesting that. Now, Picasso, of course, is a European, protesting a European reality. But we've already seen from Hopper, and we'll see from Faulkner, that Americans were feeling that same anxiety, and that American modernism was fueled by the same kind of challenge to the crisis of modernity that inspired artists like Picasso. One term from this slide I haven't mentioned that I do want to talk about is one of the linchpins of modernism is radical aesthetic experimentation. In other words, these are accomplished artists who are very deliberately experimenting with the art form and challenging the parameters of the art form. Compare a Picasso to a Michelangelo. It's hard to imagine that human beings who lived on the same planet could create art forms that are so different. But Picasso is very much the descendant of Michelangelo, in the sense of, like Michelangelo, he's pushing the parameters of the form. But unlike Michelangelo, modernist artists like Picasso are encountering a world that is profoundly in chaos, a world that is profoundly challenging traditional notions of transcendence. And so they turn to heroic individualistic expression, artistic expression, as a counter to that and as a tool for trying to explore alternative visions, alternative ways of understanding the world of chaos and maybe finding some meaning in it or transcending it. So let's finish up with Faulkner. I'm sorry this lecture's gone on so long, but I think it's really important to lay out these ideas. How is Faulkner a modernist? How is As I Lay Dying a modernist novel? Well, to invoke the terminology I used in the previous slide, the first thing about As I Lay Dying that you will notice right away is how narratively disjointed it is, right? As our introduction in our text is going to explain, I think there's 59 different chapters, 15 different narrators. The text does not follow a clearly laid out plot line guided by a controlling voice. And I think it is because it doesn't believe that that is a representation of reality. That for Faulkner, reality is much more complex, and that reality is woven by dialogic relations between different voices. That if we really want the truth, we're never going to find it in one voice. In fact, it's one voice that's an artificial construct. The reality of life is that there's a negotiation over truth between multiple voices and multiple understandings that we have to negotiate as reader or as a member of a culture going through the kind of tumult that our 20th century culture was then and our 21st century culture is now. As I Lay Dying is marked by aesthetic experimentation. The chapters have a stream of consciousness flow to them. Not total stream of consciousness, because there does seem to be in some chapters some narrative drive, but lots of digression, lots of following the random movement of the human psyche and the human mind in reaction to and interaction with other people and voices. Plot is revealed in a really disorienting way. I want to encourage you, if you find that very frustrating, you can always go look at some of the different various plot summary things online if that's helpful for you. I think it's more fun. I think it gives you a more authentic experience of the novel if you don't. If you just try to muscle your way through it and figure it out, or send me a quick text or email if you're confused. But if that makes you miserable, you're welcome to use. It's not cheating to go look at Spark Notes or something. I don't think the analysis you'll find there is very good, but the plot summaries are generally pretty accurate. This is a novel of protest. And I told you that one of my beliefs is that a lot of modernism springs out of a protest against modernity. Sometimes it's a celebration of modernity, but often it's also a protest. And Faulkner is protesting his anxiety about Southern agrarian poverty and our failure as a nation to sort of address it, and what a horrific force it is in people's lives. I think he's deeply concerned about isolation and alienation of the individual in this Southern agrarian, poor, rural context. He's concerned deeply about the oppression of women. It's a major theme throughout the text that we're going to explore through Addie and Dewey Dell. And then you've got sort of this larger argument, especially in the second half of the text, where material desire undercuts other forms of idealism, our shared humanity, whether that's a democratic idealism or a Christian idealism. That material desire can destroy families, can isolate individuals. It's a very powerful and corrosive thing in Faulkner's world. Finally, it's really important to note the dark humor in Faulkner's text. And this is another sort of modernist move. Irony, and sort of a profound sense of the absurd and the grotesque. These are hallmarks of modernist humor and hallmarks of Faulkner. You will find yourself laughing out loud at times at horrible things that are happening, but Faulkner is very deliberately pushing the boundaries of the absurd. So as you're reading through Faulkner, don't hesitate to come back to this slideshow for some guidance about context and ideas that might help you out. I'll be sharing others as we move along through the novel together, and I want to make sure you take your time to read the introduction as you start reading the novel. It's really important to have read that first before you start reading the novel, because that's where you'll get a really nice frame of why we're reading this novel and what's important to look for. And then, of course, as we read on, we're going to be looking at a lot of contextual and critical reactions to the text that will supplement our ideas. All right, again, I apologize for the long video lecture, but I think it was important to lay the groundwork for this very challenging text. See you in Blackboard.